Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is Ukraine War Frontline update for the 14th of June 2023. Let's go first of all to a kind of rough outline by the Institute for the Study of War before we go into a little bit more detail. So Ukrainian forces continued counteroffensive operations in the last in at least three different directions and made further limited territorial gains on June the 13th, yesterday. Ukrainian Deputy Defense Minister Malyar reported that Ukrainian forces advanced by 250 meters northeast of Bakhmut and by 200 meters south of Bakhmut. Malyar also reported that Ukrainian forces advanced 500 to 1,000 meters, that's a kilometer, in the past 24 hours around the administrative border between Zaporizhia and Donetsk. So that's around Velika Novosilka, liberating around 3 square kilometers of territory in the area. Ukrainian spokesperson reported that Ukrainian forces have also liberated over 100 square kilometers of territory since beginning the counteroffensive operations. Prigozhin claimed yesterday that he assesses that Ukrainian forces have likely liberated more than 100 square kilometers. So that's really interesting. You've got a pro-Russian, obviously a Russian military leader in this conflict, saying, confirming really what the Ukrainians are claiming. Interestingly, when we were talking about Putin claiming 54 Russian tanks were lost, this is fascinating. Said 54 Russian tanks have been lost since the beginning of the counteroffensive. That actually tallies with what the Ukrainian general staff have said. So when you get pro-Russian voices saying the Ukrainians general staff are just lying, talking rubbish, actually Putin's claim pretty much tallies with them. So either Ukrainian general staff are lying or Putin's lying. You can't have it both ways. Anyway, to continue. Oh, that's uncomfortable. Uh, Wagner Wagner financier Prigozhin has confirmed that Russian sources claim that Ukrainian forces continued ground assaults southwest of Orikhiv and south of Hilaypole in western Zaporizhia Oblast on the 9th of June, the 12th to 13th. Russian sources widely reported that the tempo of Ukrainian operations in the Orikhiv area has declined in recent days, and yes, so there's also been the destruction of a couple of small dams. Right, okay, so that's your general understanding of what's going on. We're moving, first of all, to the, I have to do this on different mouse, so we're moving to the northeast sector, which is here, Kupiansk to Svatova to Kreminna front line. As you can see, the defences down that front line are much further back from the line itself. They're more in line with Svatova or behind Svatova. And so if the Ukrainians did make some advances, they would have to then deal with those entrenchments and fortifications. Okay, so we're going to go to here, Kupiansk to Svatova. ISW in the area says, as we get there, not an awful lot of activities taking place. Basically, I would go as far as to say, yeah, continue to hold in the bridgeheads into Varichina. That's up near Kupiansk, but really, it doesn't. There's no activity reported until you get to Bilohorivka, which is down here south of the forest. There are some claims that Ukrainians have pushed back in the forest area towards Dubrova, retaken some land there. I was watching Andrew Perpetua last night on his live stream, talking about this, but he was unsure. The area that the Ukrainians might have regained was area that he had them already controlling. I said that last week there was geolocated footage to suggest that the Russians controlled areas in here. So it could be that the Ukrainians have pushed back in there. I'm not sure. Just to remind listeners and to explain to new listeners, there are two lines on my maps. Pretty much, I'm ready to go up and down. I've had some help as well. Some viewers helped me too. The Ukrainian line the pro-Ukrainian mapper Andrew Perpetua's line is here in blue. That represents the Russian defensive line, as does the red line, which is the Syriac map pro-Russian mapper. So you have two Russian lines here, represented by both sides of the story, giving their account of what is taking place. I trust Andrew Perpetua quite a lot. I listen to him talk about it and how he gets his information. He has contacts on the ground. He also does a lot of satellite imagery analysis. What's quite interesting is, so if we're coming down, really not a lot of activity going on here. There's possibly Russians trying to push back in this Vasily Rozdalivka area around here, Yakovlivka towards Vasily and Krasnopolivka, really towards Roslivka. Interesting as to why they'd be going on the offensive now, but anyway, they did lose some land here in the Vasily area, I think, recently. But going to talk about Bakhmut, there's been this idea that there's not an awful lot of movement, but actually it's really difficult to work out because there are two things going on. There's really big information and blackout. The operational security in the area is very tight, so you don't hear a lot out. But also, it's been quite cloudy in the area recently, which means satellite imagery is difficult to come by with any kind of clarity. So, mappers, people like Andrew Perpetua, who often will make adaptations to their map, are unable to see where, I mean, he goes down to the granular, looking at where there's been shelling, where there's been thermobaric munitions exploding in certain fields. And if he's unable to do that and unable to help confirm who's got control of what field and where, then it means that mappers don't change. So that actually weather can affect information as much as things like information blackout or to some degree like information blackouts. Anyway, what's been going on in the area? Well, actually, if we go to Bakhivka, there's this dam here where actually there is no water in it other than up this end. There's a little bit of water there. Now there's been the Ukrainians attacked around here and got into the outskirts of Bakhivka, and then the Russians pushed back. And in fact, they had 3 to 4 days of putting in a huge counteroffensive here. They talked it up quite a bit. They were drawing troops from Paraskevivka and other areas behind to try and beef up this counterattack. Apparently, they lost an awful lot of troops. They didn't really, it kind of failed, as in, didn't push the Ukrainians back particularly. It may be that Ukrainians are back here and it's more positional. And since then, the Ukrainians are now going on an attack themselves. And last couple of days, they've taken like 50 to 100 meters a day, a trench line a day, which doesn't sound huge, but it is slow, attritional gains for the Ukrainians, attritional to the Russians. Apparently, the statistics are still in the favor of the Ukrainians here. The Russians are taking large losses. Apparently, the Ukrainian troops are optimistic. They're happy. They're happy to be on the attack rather than defensive. If you think of how they would be feeling after 11 months of being in Bakhmut and gradually being pushed back and back and back, to then suddenly be the ones on the offensive psychologically is going to be really quite impactful for these people. Anyway, yeah, they lost a couple of tanks, I think, back here sometime previously, but they're actually, doing a good job of attacking around Bakhivka. And I think they've also made some gains around here towards Yehidna. Or it might even be, yeah, I think it is around here. So that gain, as you see, Andrew Perpetua's map is different from the other two, and that could be this pressure that they're putting on towards Yehidne. They would like to take this junction there. Apparently, that's quite a significant, even though it might not have particular strategic kind of tactical advantage in the area anymore. I mean, these ground lines of communication, I suppose everything's pretty much screwed around here, but it's quite apparently quite a psychological sort of morale boosting area. I guess it might be like this. I don't even remember. We talked so much about this slightly raised ground there with a gas station there that was involved in so much toing and froing earlier on in the conflict. Anyway, so there's activity going on there. There are gains to be made by the Ukrainians. They are making gains north and south of Bakhmut. They are heavily shelling areas in Bakhmut, and apparently I think they are still quite active in this area as well. So there's presence for the Ukrainians there. That's in that southwestern area of Bakhmut where they still have this foothold near the MiG monument that was there. So anyway, if we come further down south, there are rumors that the Ukrainians have made a significant gain in this area, but it's not represented on any mapping. Andrew Perpetua was talking about that last night, so not sure exactly where that is. It could be in this forest land here, or it could be in other places. There could be some significant, I think it's actually that forest land he was talking about. So it could be that has been taken, but it's more sort of rumors. There are claims, flying around, but no verification. Deep State map changed their map such that this area is now not under Russian control. That's more in line with what we knew from both Andrew Perpetua and Syriac maps to some degree. So the yellow line represents Deep State maps. Deep State map has not changed much over the last few weeks, pretty much anywhere. Very cautious, tentative in their changes because I think they're under a lot of operational security guidance. But yeah, that is a change in Bakhmut that we haven't seen for some time. And the Ukrainians are trying to push the Russians back further across from the canal here. The Ukrainians, that is, gained this territory off the Russians over the last week, and apparently the Russians are really trying to take that back. So they are putting some pressure on the Ukrainians in that area. And as you come further to the south, I've adapted my maps to reflect more closely Andrew Perpetua as a blue line here. And it looks like I don't know whether it's me rejigging my map or whether actually there has been some gains further south towards Mayorsk and onwards. But certainly, I previously had the Ukrainian lines a lot, or the Russian lines, somewhat different around here. So it could be that Ukrainians have made some gains, pressure around that Mayorsk area. We know they have been active there over the last week or so. Right, and then we come on down to Avdiivka. Not a lot of information coming out of here either. The Russians, I think, are trying to push back into the south of Avdiivka itself. But we'll go to the ISW and see what they have to say. Yeah, and just to let you know, the Cherevati spokesperson for the Ukrainians is saying that the Russians are still deploying additional elite VDV airborne paratroopers to the Bakhmut area. But as for Avdiivka, not a lot really to report. There are repelled attacks there. There is a Ukrainian claim that the Russian military command is transferring personnel from Kherson Oblast to Avdiivka, the South Akhmat and the North Akhmat Chechen units. So they are there. Chechens are also in Marinka too, where there are continued repelled attacks. So really not a lot to report from Avdiivka of any kind of territorial exchanges, just that there is activity there. Someone on my thread, a pro-Russian on my threads, like, why don't you talk about videos of Russians taking loads of POWs, Ukrainian captives in Avdiivka? And I was like, oh, I've not heard anything about that. I had a look, and there was a video from the 25th of May, so that's like going back sort of 3 weeks now. So I was like, well, if that's it, that's probably not why I'm talking about it. But there's also calls to whether that was definitely a true video or not. But supposedly some POWs, I think 13 of them, Ukrainians captured in the Avdiivka area. But as I say, that's not from the last 3 weeks. So there you go. Anyway, moving on to Marinka. Repelled attacks there. No particular news that gives any explicit details. As you can see, there's a difference between two mappers, Ukrainian and Russian mapper here. Certainly in Novomykhailivka area, coming on to Volodymyrivka. But this is all quiet. It's all quiet around Vuhledar, and it's all mainly happening in this area, Velika Novosilka. There's quite a big mapping change, and that's kind of reflected in Poulet-Volant. Well, we'll go to war map, and then I'll explain what's going on in Poulet-Volant. So this is just to give an overview of what's taking place in the area of the Zaporizhia front line. So we have the Velika Novosilka salient here, or the attempt to get some kind of bridgehead in that neck of the woods. And then there's some activity in the Orikhiv area and Lobkova area, perhaps a little bit south of Halaypole as well. And to give, wrong way, to give you a bit more detail of the Velika Novosilka, that is a situation there. Now, if you were to look at Poulet-Volant's map, you'd be thinking, oh my goodness, it's looking really bad for the Ukrainians. The Russians have really pushed them back. Actually, this is so. I think Poulet-Volant relies a lot on Andrew Perpetua as well, to be perfectly fair. And Andrew Perpetua's map did exactly this. So yesterday, his map actually came down all the way down here, because the information that came out when the Ukrainians started attacking was quite chaotic, and there were some claims that they've made advances all the way down in certain areas. And then it's just, when the dust settles, you're like, okay, let's readjust. And Poulet-Volant had to do that as well. And in fact, someone questioned him on that, and he said, "I've just adjusted the zone. That's basically all there." So that's just an adjustment. It's not the Russians attacking again. Anyway, what is taking place is that there's a lot of talk about this settlement Makarivka. The Russians claim to have taken that back a number of times. I think there's just quite heavy fighting in the area. It appears that Ukraine does have control over that. These settlements to the south are somewhat contested. Uh, there is some interesting analysis to be done here, and Konstantin, who's involved with the Ukrainian military, and Andrew Perpetua were talking on a live stream last night about what is going on here from a kind of tactical point of view, maybe operational point of view. It appears that the Russians are defending these settlements really heavily. And in defending these settlements heavily, they are using a lot of mechanized equipment, and they're actually apparently losing a lot of mechanized equipment as well. There are just pretty high numbers of losses for the Russians. I know they'll tell you about what's going on in Oroki, but in this area, it appears the Russians are losing a lot. And it's kind of like some people weren't expecting this. They're expecting the Russians to retreat to their defensive lines and then defend within the trenches and then within the fortifications. So if you go back to look at the war map, I don't know, yeah, you can see here that actually the fortifications don't really start until a few settlements back, but they are piling in defenses, active defense here, almost like offense is the first line of defense by attacking, trying to take these settlements and resisting quite heavily. Either they are not confident in their defenses, or I'm not quite sure. But the two last night was saying that actually this works in the favour of the Ukrainians. So pro-Russians go, "Oh, this is cope." But actually, if the Russians are going to exhaust their forces before you get to the defenses, this makes negotiating the defenses easier. So if they are going, and the claim is that they actually don't have that much mechanized equipment. So you normally have one piece of mechanized equipment for every 20 soldiers, maybe one tank for every 100. The Russians don't have that. They've got maybe 300,000 people around here, but that's going to be split between different types of troops, infantry, mechanized tank crews, all sorts, artillerymen, whatnot. So they have a certain amount of troops, not enough to defend this whole front line adequately, and they don't have enough equipment, and the reserves are quite lightly equipped with mechanized equipment. But if they're throwing that into here, then once that is attrited and out of the way, and the Ukrainians aren't using their main stuff yet, then that means that the Ukrainians will be in a better position to then negotiate what I think will be a tricky, traverse of these defensive lines, these fortifications that you see on this main map here. So yeah, by all means, Russians throw everything at defending right now before they get to the fortifications, and that means that when you get to the fortifications, you only have to think of the tank trenches and the minefields and the dragon's teeth, rather than a whole bunch of mechanized equipment, because that's already been lost previously. Syriac Maps says that the Ukrainians have made some gains. So what they say, Ukrainian army re-entered again the town of Makarivka and fully secured the small village of Levadne, which is over to the west. So on my map, let's go to my map and get a sense of this. Okay. So they came down through Velika Novosilka, Vremivka, took Neskuchna, took Storozheve. We've got geolocated evidence of that, and we've got lots of geolocated evidence in Makarivka, although the claims are that's gone backwards and forwards. So I'm not sure that it has. It appears that the Russians have tried this counteroffensive, and they've now admitted that it hasn't worked, as I reported on the news, with Wargonzo and no, Romanov and other Russian sources basically all agreeing that Russians do not have control of Makarivka. Fighting, therefore, is probably in these settlements below Staromayorska and Urizhayny, which is, according to Andrew Perpetua, in the grey zone. Syriac Maps is for a little more generous to the Russians in that area, and also over towards Novodorivka. Rivnepil is apparently, there's a lot of stiff resistance there. Some have said that that's gone backwards and forwards. I'm not sure it has, but the Russians are certainly putting in quite a lot of mechanized equipment and support to maintain control of that settlement. And Levadny there, that's where Syriac Maps admits the settlement is now under Ukrainian control. As you can see, their lines are somewhat further back. So if we go and see what no reports, saying that footage reportedly from Starominivka, saying that Russian trucks carrying ammunition were destroyed by joint actions of the 129th Separate Territorial Defense. Okay, so this is the settlement that previously people like Wargonzo were saying is quite a critical settlement. So this is here. Once you get past here, you're starting to get into the area of the defenses, the trench lines and minefields. So this is, if that gets lost, then that's critical as far as the Russians will be on the defensive in a more major way here, and that the Ukrainians are softening targets, taking out ammunition depots and trucks, logistics in that area means that that everything appears to be working in a methodical way that you would expect given a highly planned counteroffensive operation. If we go to the Institute for the Study of War, American military think tank, they talk about this area, say that Russian sources claiming that fighting is ongoing near Staromayorsk and Urizhny. So that's where I was saying that these are likely contested. So that's Russian sources claiming fighting is there. And that the Russian MOD claimed that Russian forces repelled 2 Ukrainian attacks near Rivnopil. So this is this area that is being fiercely contested. Ukrainian Deputy Defense Minister Malyar reported that on June the 13th, Ukrainian forces advanced 500 to 1,000 meters and liberated up to 3 square kilometers of territory in the Berdyansk direction over the past 24 hours. So, I mean, it's about expectations. So we might have thought that there'd be all these lightning maneuvers where the Ukrainians would push back the Russians really quickly and they'd just take absolutely loads of territory. And actually, I think that's just been unrealistic. And because in the first opening hours, they managed to take quite a lot, as you'd expect, because that's them suddenly attacking. Russians would be like, right, this is where they're attacking. Okay, now that Russians are able to commit to defending certain areas and have some idea of what the Ukrainians are doing, things will slow down necessarily. It's also worth bearing in mind, regardless of how bullish you are on Ukraine's capabilities, says Nathan Ruza, these fortifications aren't something we can wave away. It will not be easy to overcome the line, and it will likely be a battle of attrition, but Ukraine has options and no reason yet to doubt their ability. Now, this is also worth taking into account. This is coming from Samuel Bender, who's a pretty good expert on things like drones and that kind of autonomous systems and whatnot. So he's looked at a Russian Telegram channel, or channels that are discussing a new Ukrainian air defense suppression tactic. So this is what they're talking about: how Russians are able to work quite effectively, at least according to them. Russian aviation launched guided bombs or missiles from a safe distance, forcing Ukrainian military to position their air defense systems close to the front line to shoot them down. So I was talking yesterday about how these FAB 500 bombs that the Russians can release, they have an advantage in the air because the Ukrainian Air Force don't have as longer range with their air-to-air missiles. So a threat from air-to-air defense is less. So they can move further forward, and it's really only thinking about the ground-based air defense systems, or GBADs, that would take them down. So they're getting closer to the front line, releasing these FAB 500 bombs from, say, 50 kilometers away, so that these are really useful munitions for them. So they can be 50 kilometers back. See, that's what, 20 kilometers there. So they can release these munitions from quite some way back. That will hammer the front line with meaningful big explosions, and that then puts the Ukrainians on the back foot. So then they bring their air defenses forward. And then the Russians launched Lancet drones to target those air defense positions and hit Ukrainian soldiers with the help of sniper ambushes. When the Ukrainian military tries to pursue these snipers, they flee on all-terrain vehicles and are protected by mortar screening fire. Quote, that is, the Ukrainian air defense is given no choice. If they will not shoot down the Russian glide bombs, then important targets are hit. So I don't know if that's the air defenses trying to take out the airframes or the glide bombs themselves. Probably the glide bombs themselves, right? Important targets are hit on the front line. If they try to shoot them down, their air defense systems can be destroyed. This scheme is working. Our field commanders are more resourceful and smarter than many generals in Moscow. At a local level, they show how it is generally possible to suppress adversary anti-aircraft defenses. This process of mastering new wars strongly reminds me of Afghanistan, says this Russian source, where commanders spontaneously applied network databases when the raiders negotiated directly with artillerymen and helicopter pilots for operations while bypassing the generals. Previously, Russian commanders experimented with short-range quadcopters and FPVs for greater efficiency. This post shows experimentation at a much larger scale. Even if this is part of propaganda, Lancet drones are indeed becoming more dangerous. Uh, so this is, all the usual caveats apply. Pro-Kremlin Telegram channels. All content is part of a larger information environment. However, certain key tech and systems patterns described or identified are in fact apparent and are used by the Russian military. So that is, if that's happening, then that's a bit of a worry. It's about sort of baiting the Ukrainians into using air defense systems, bring them further forward, and then hitting them with lancets. And I guess that would also be the same for SHORADs, your short range systems, even if they're man pads, man held, and then getting taken out with snipers, that kind of thing. So that's obviously taking place there. Now, as we move to the west, I'll come out on my map and explain where that is. So Velika Novosilka is here. There's been some rearranging of the map to be more in line with, or somewhere between where the Russians and the Ukrainian lines were, as according to the two mappers. It's now in the middle. We've seen the Ukrainians gain some territory on this western part of the salient. And as we come further to the west as a whole, activity south of Hilaypole in Droznyanka, perhaps. Let's see if Poulet Volant has any further maps. There is. So yeah, coming towards Orikhiv then, I think that's the last one. So only a couple of maps there. So you can see there really is limited activity taking place here. So these are only sort of smaller scale attacks in a handful of places. This isn't your full counteroffensive. It is trying to work out, where to attack. Anyway, the activities to south of Hilaypole, I don't know if that's producing much in terms of territorial gain. Then Malatokmachka, south of there, that's where the Ukrainians lost quite a bit of equipment. We've seen footage of at least one of those Leopard tanks being towed away, which is really good news because it means that will be fixable and back on a front line at some point. And then as you can see from Poulet Volant's map, the Ukrainians have made some gains in the Lobkove area here on the way towards Kamyansky and the edge of the now fairly dry reservoir. So Poulet Volant's map here shows you that there is some Ukrainian gain around that area, and we know that Lobkove is now under Ukrainian control. So let's go to the ISW, see what they say. So Ukrainian forces conducted ground attacks in western Zaporizhia Oblast yesterday. Russian mill bloggers claim that Ukrainian forces conducted operations near Piatykatsky and Dorozhnyanka, and that fighting is ongoing south of Orikhiv and near Lobkove. So that is taking place there. And there's another claim that actually there's a lessening of the intensity of operations around these places. So again, it's not the full brunt. They're just testing the Russians out, I guess, maybe drawing them away from certain areas that will allow there to be weaknesses elsewhere. As I talked about yesterday, the analogy that you've got a blanket that's too small for the bed, you put it into one area of the bed to cover yourself somewhere, it leaves somewhere else on the bed open. It's the same like the whole of the front line. The Russians just don't have enough troops to successfully maintain decent defensive capacity along the whole front line. So as soon as the Ukrainians attack in one place, they're drawing troops in. We've seen that in Marinka and in Adiivka, they're drawing Chechens from elsewhere Marinka and Adiivka, and then up in Bakhmut, they're drawing troops, VDV still, conventional forces from elsewhere. So wherever they're drawing them from, there will be less coverage, and that will present an opportunity for the Ukrainians to exploit. All the while, this activity is taking place on a front line. Don't forget that the Storm Shadows and the HIMARS are absolutely hammering places like Berdyansk, Mariupol, Melitopol, Tokmak. Tokmak took quite a beating last night. All of these places, and then no doubt places like Volnovakha getting hit, and that is weakening the Russian ability to defend. So you get this situation where the impatient person might be like, come on, Ukraine, why aren't you attacking? Why aren't you attacking? If Ukraine attack with troops, they will lose troops and equipment. We've seen that. Whereas each day, if they like the attacks on Primorsk down here, that might have led to perhaps 100 Russian troops dying, that has resulted in literally 0 Ukrainian troops dying. So, on the one hand, they need to get on and do their counteroffensive, but on the other hand, they can weaken the Russian defenses every day with really precise and well planned hits behind enemy lines. And so you can understand why they're not so willing to throw everything in there all at once. And we'll have to do that, but remember each day that the Russians will be weakening in their ability to eventually defend. So my point here is that okay, let's say, and I'm making this up, right, but say 100 troops died in Primorsk, and then 2 weeks later, the Ukrainians decide to attack a particular place. You now have 100 troops that can't be brought to defend there. So that is weakening their defensive capabilities in a really considerable way. And if that is happening time and time again, then it means that when they do attack, they'll have a much higher chance of succeeding and grinding out what is left. So if the Russians are both piling in mechanized equipment into these early engagements, whilst also losing troops behind the lines, when you come to the final engagements where the Ukrainians are going to have to negotiate these defensive lines, then they're in a much better position to do that, and they can concentrate solely on those fortifications rather than be concerned with heaps of mechanized equipment and troops. But anyway, thank you. That's my analysis for today. That's the front line for the 14th of June. Really appreciate all your support. Please like, subscribe, and share. And check out the extra video I'll be doing later. Toodle pips.